So, Howard, the 2022-2023 NBA season has just concluded. Obviously, Nikola Jokic and the Denver Nuggets won their first ever championship. What kind of major takeaway did you take from this particular season? You've covered the league for, almost 3 decades now?
26 years.
26 years.
So we're getting there, yeah.
Yeah. Have you seen any change in the league over the past few years compared to when you started?
There's a lot that's changed, of course, including the style of the game. But I think that what struck me about this season in particular, including the conclusion with the Nuggets winning the championship over the Miami Heat, is that you see a Nuggets team that, in a lot of respects, wasn't necessarily built like the big powerhouses of the past. So maybe we had a tough time recognizing that they were on this trajectory until they actually did it. And they played a team in the Miami Heat that's built nothing like most teams that have made the finals or won championships in the last 20 years or so. And both of them are a product of, and that finals was a product of this incredible parity that we have almost never seen in the NBA. It was historic levels of parity, basically. And the data bears that out. The league's own assessments based on how tightly packed the standings were, the spread between, the second or third seed in the conference and the 8th seed or the 10th seed or whatever. We've never seen anything like it. The distribution of high-level talent across the league is pretty even. We don't have really super teams, although the Suns are trying. And because of that, there's just no clear power structure. Everybody's pretty tightly packed, which is not to say that the Nuggets weren't clearly the best team in the NBA this season. They clearly were, and they just proved that definitively. But it was a different kind of season. And then the other takeaway is that the finals itself, you had two teams that stuck to a plan, that had their core players together for multiple years, that had their coaches together for, or with the team for a long time, right? Eric Spoelstra is, I think, the second longest tenured coach in the NBA after Greg Popovich, and Michael Malone, I believe, is fourth, I think, behind Spoelstra and Steve Kerr. So you have two of the longest tenured coaches. You have continuity in your leadership. You have continuity in their front offices. You have a continuity in terms of just their planning. Like, they had a vision, they pursued it, they were patient, they let their young players evolve to the point where they could, achieve at a high level. If they had a couple pieces that maybe they weren't sure if they fit, they stuck with them. They made smart additions along the way. So I think this is a great example of the best way to operate a franchise. I think the Nuggets and the Heat are two model franchises right now. And if you can't necessarily copy the blueprint, no one else is going to go find a generational superstar in the second round, probably, although you never know. And there is no other Nikola Jokic. But you can follow the basic outline of saying, you know what, patience matters, continuity matters, sticking with a coach you believe in matters, and being smart about the way you manage your roster and your salary cap.
And we haven't seen any repeat champions basically since 2017, 2018 with the Warriors. Obviously, they won again last year, but it's been different champions for 5 years now. And that spoke to your point about parity as well. I'm sure the league is pretty happy about making this so unpredictable. I know we can always say they want the Celtics and Lakers in the finals because it draws in ratings, but the fact that more fans are engaged, I have to assume is a good thing.
There's two ways of looking at it. So we talk about the NBA as being a league of dynasties, right? The Celtics, the Lakers, the Bulls of the 90s, the most recent Warriors dynasty, the Spurs. And sure, those are great for ratings in June because people can easily recognize those teams. If you've got a dynasty or a super team, they've been on in the spotlight for a long time, for multiple years, and they have readily identifiable stars, and they're polarizing. You either are rooting passionately for them or against them. So there is something to the role that dynasties have played in the popularity of the NBA, but especially in this era where you have a lot of player mobility, where players are moving around a lot, especially the superstars, the thing that has always worried me, and I think that concerns the league, for sure does, is that you need belief in the other markets, right? Because those super teams and those dynasties are usually not going to be in Indianapolis or Charlotte or Memphis or New Orleans or Minneapolis. They're going to be in LA, New York, Chicago, Miami, either a big market or a glamour market. And so the Milwaukee Bucks won a championship a couple of years ago. That's great for the league. The Denver Nuggets just won a championship. That's great for the league. The Toronto Raptors, big market, big city, but not a destination market for NBA players for their existence. And for a long time, there were players who just even didn't like the idea of playing there because, it's not the U.S., and so that teams in these markets can win championships, I think is healthier for the league. And it's not to say that dynasties are unhealthy, but you need belief in the other markets. We've had a decade plus here, starting with LeBron in 2010, of superstars leaving small markets to go to the bigger markets or glamour markets. And that, I think, creates a certain instability and saps belief in those markets. Your fans sit there thinking, oh, great, we got Giannis. Well, he's just going to leave anyway. Why wouldn't he? LeBron left Cleveland. Chris Paul left New Orleans. Carmelo left Denver. And you have this pattern going on. And so I think this is the remedy right now. Having a system where the small markets or less, the non-destination markets can find a different path to win championships, where superstar talent is dispersed more evenly. To me, that, again, it creates belief in those markets. Those fan bases now can see proof of concept. Right. Hey, if Denver can do it, if Milwaukee can do it, then, hey, maybe we here in Memphis can do it, or Indianapolis, or wherever.
And that speaks to the volume of stars. So you kind of mentioned it, that the talent level is kind of spread around. And I think one part of that is the league has gotten so much better recently to identifying talents. I mean, we're seeing stars land in the late first round, in the second round. And this is like a theory of mine that I want to just bounce off of you a little bit here. Because we saw in the early 2000s, it was all about the athleticism, right? Like the Tyrese Thomases, the Stroman Swifts. It seems like now NBA teams are pivoting more to players who have, fundamentals, high level of skill, and athleticism is, nice to have, but not necessarily need to have. Jokic is obviously a prime example of that. Have you seen some of the similar traits of that in recent years?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think it's funny that you mention like Stroman Swift. I have used him as the avatar of the landmines that exist in the draft. I've used him as my stand-in, and I need to update it because that's now like 20-something years ago. Tyrese Thomas even that reference is getting a little bit old.
Yes.
We need more recent examples, and there still are recent examples. Michael Beasley comes to mind, and even that's starting to be a little while ago. But teams always fall in love with crazy hops, right? If you can jump out of the gym, you're going to be behind the draft board, even if you don't quite have the handles or the three-point shooting, or you may not be the best at reading the floor, but man, if you're big and long and can jump out of the gym and you can dunk, it's a hard thing to resist. And a lot of mistakes made in the draft over the decades are because of that exact thing. And Stroman Swift is always the example I use, so I love that you brought him up. I think in today's NBA, the problem kind of fixed itself in a way. The game has evolved to the point where skills matter so much more now, right? I've often thought, and this is no knock on him, but I've often thought, what would Charles Oakley be in today's NBA? Would Charles Oakley have to become a three-point shooter? Yeah. The guys in past decades who were just your enforcer types, for lack of a better term, or just your rugged rebounder types.
Right.
You could just go out and get 10 rebounds, and that was enough. You could rebound and defend a little bit. You didn't have to be able to handle the ball, shoot, pass, anything. I don't know that player can exist in today's NBA, where spacing matters so much more, where the three-point shot is so prominent. And hey, look, Oakley maybe would have learned to shoot the three for all we know. But I do think that, to the extent that you're right, that I think you're onto something there, that teams, I don't know if they've gotten smarter about the draft. Teams still make plenty of mistakes. If they weren't making mistakes, then Jokic wouldn't be a second-round pick.
Right.
Rudy Gobert wouldn't be 27th. Giannis wouldn't be 15th. Every year there are at least a couple of players outside of the lottery who become superstars. And if teams had really gotten that much smarter about the draft, they'd be picking those guys in the top 5 or top 10, right? So, but all that said, there is more emphasis now on recognizing players who understand the game, who are intuitive about the game, and who, yes, can do more than just jump out of the gym, who can, pass, defend, read a defense, understand intricacies of an offense, depending on your system. I do think those things are more important today.
Yeah, I mean, Luka Doncic as well is one of those primary examples. I mean, obviously coming from Europe, We tend to look at the Jokic's and the Doncic's a little bit more.
Sure.
And what we're seeing, because a lot of us have followed the NBA for decades, we're seeing just a shift in mentality, I think, where if you're a below-the-rim player and you somehow dominate in that field, it just makes you that much more potent in the playoffs, for example. Even though Luka didn't miss the playoffs this year, we've seen him just utterly dominate in the postseason.
Yeah.
And it just speaks, at least from my point of view, to the necessity of being able to rely on a game instead of your hops. I mean, Zion Williamson is also one of those situations right now where he's played 29 games in 2 years, and there's no doubt about the fact that he is one of the best players in the league when he's healthy, but it's tough to actually be able to count on him at this point. And if he was more of a guy who could stay below the basket, didn't have to put that much more pressure on his knees, maybe there was more to get from him.
Yeah, it's possible. I also think there's an interesting aspect to this conversation where we've always defined athleticism in the NBA as some combination of speed, quickness, and jumping ability. And people have started to push back. Well, look at James Harden. James Harden is mostly a below-the-rim player, right? Yeah. One of the greatest scorers we've ever seen, an incredibly efficient scorer, but his deceleration is a really important part of that. His guile and his ability to throw you off and create space. And isn't that a form of athleticism? It's just not the athleticism that we're used to saying. We have this shorthand where we say the word athletic or athleticism, and the first thing you think of is a Michael Jordan type dunking over everybody, jumping over everybody, or it's quickness, or maybe it's Allen Iverson's type of athleticism, right, where he's short and he's not going to dunk that much, but man, he just can blow right by you. So we're having to kind of reassess what we define as athletic, because Harden was a different kind of athletic, and Luka is kind of a little bit in that Harden mold, right? He's bigger than Harden, but Luka, a little bit of that same kind of guile and body control that allows you to create space and keep a defender off you. And, isn't that a form of athleticism? So, right. But I also think that today's game, again, where guys have created different ways to create space, like the step back jumper wasn't, and the step back three in particular, was not as nearly as prominent 20 years ago, right? Like, I'm not saying it just got invented yesterday, but this is a much more prominent part of the game today. The Euro step, wasn't a prominent part of the NBA 20 years ago, and then for a while it was just Europeans doing the Euro step, and now it's everybody, including lumbering, American-born big men, right? Like everybody, yeah. I feel like everybody's got a Euro step now. So part of it is that players have, as they've always been, they've been very creative in finding different ways to create space and get off a shot. And not all of it requires the same kind of old school, quote unquote, athleticism that involves running fast, jumping high, or being incredibly explosive.
Yeah, I mean, lateral movement as well. You could count that in. That's sure. Something we always tend to forget about. Really, it's you see the straight line drives, you see the verticals, but that movement back and forth, that's a major part of it. That's certainly under the rim as well. And the reason I kind of go into that is, of course, the European angle as well, because what we've seen over the course of the last few years is a lot of these guys coming in and actually doing very well in the post, which was somewhat of an abandoned area for a while, at least. Like, you didn't really have guys who moved to, back to the basket more along the lines of face-ups, or maybe sticking around the 15-foot area. Now you actually are seeing guys more so returning to that post, not just for the score, but also just to play, make, and initiate the offense. Do you think the NBA as a whole have just gotten more creative over the past 20 years?
It's a hard thing to assess in some regard. So, back to the basket play, post play, and especially among big men was such a prominent part of the NBA for decades. And in the three-point era, it's kind of become de-emphasized. But we're also in the analytics era where they've been able to, with the help of tracking cameras and just all the other data that's available, you could define it and say, post-ups are a very low percentage play compared to some other play types. Right. So we're going to de-emphasize it, and maybe even just the skill sets of guys arriving in the NBA, they've been conditioned to be more face-up players, and the emphasis on the three means everybody is concentrating on that more. Post play requires great footwork, and maybe not everybody has the footwork or wants to work on the footwork, and so a lot of different things have kind of conspired to de-emphasize post play, and I think it's probably at its lowest percentage of overall scoring types or play types in the history of the league over the last few years. Right? It's not Your teams aren't seeking it out. It's not a
Right.
staple. But as a scoring option. But to your point, teams will deploy post-ups within their offense to set up something else, right? Get the ball close to the basket, or get it on the block, draw the defense in, survey the floor, hit an open teammate. So you can do more with a post-up than simply back your guy down in the old Shaquille O'Neal or Charles Barkley way, or Akeem Olajuwon. But it's really helpful for guys to have in their arsenal, right? There will be times within a game where everything else is kind of cut off, or you've got a smaller defender on you, and hey, you better have that in your arsenal. You better have some of the footwork and the ability to hit that turnaround shot. So I don't think it's ever going away. But certainly, I mean, listen, as a percentage of the game, it is way, way down.
We saw it in the finals with Jokic. Sometimes the offense just got bogged down.
Yeah.
You had to dump it in there. And while he isn't quite Shaq, like the footwork was there, the touches. His touches, by the way, is just, I don't even comprehend it, I think, fully.
It's uncanny.
Right? I mean, and the fact that he just moves the way that he does and he looks like just a big sack of dough, it's it's amazing. No, but it's interesting to me because the center position have changed so drastically.
Yeah.
I keep coming back to this point over the past few years that the center position now you're basically required to have virtually no faults. You have to be able to pass. You have to be able to shoot. You have to be able to rebound. You have to be able to score next to the basket. So like you're almost not allowed to have the holes. And you were talking about like the rebounders. And one example that popped up when you were speaking was like Reggie Evans, for example. Like just a strong rebounder, but didn't really do anything else. Like, it's a fair question. Would he get minutes in today's league?
I don't think so. Right. I don't think he would make it in today's NBA.
Simply because he doesn't have, like, the full package. Like, even Karl-Anthony Towns, who has, he's not a complete player yet. The defense is still, developing. Yeah. I think it's the kind phrase to say. But he can pass the ball. He can score near the block. He can hit the three. He can create off the dribble. He can drive. And it seems like nowadays, if you're looking at big men, that has to be a hardcore necessity.
I think it depends on who you are, right? So, like, we have different models of center now. So there's Rudy Gobert, who I would put in more like the Dikembe Mutombo school, right? Yes. Not a scorer, but he can score, and he's certainly on putbacks and stuff close to the basket. But he's not a go-to guy. You're not going to post him up. Nor is he going to step out and shoot 15-footers, and certainly not threes very often. But Rudy Gobert can guard multiple positions. He's very mobile. He's a fierce shot blocker. He can anchor your defense. And as we used to say when he was in Utah, not so much necessarily this past season with Minnesota, but he was a walking top 10 defense, right? Yeah. So there's that model. Then there's more like the Jaren Jackson Jr., Bam Adebayo. I can guard 1 through 5. And in Jaren Jackson Jr.'s case, I can also step out and hit the three. I can handle the ball. Bam Adebayo can run your offense. He can bring the ball up the floor. And they're both rim protectors, too. Jaren Jackson Jr., again, at a very elite level. But neither of them would you compare to Jokic, right? So Jokic is not going to guard 1 through 5. You don't really want him trying to switch out on the perimeter if you can help it. He's not a shot blocker. I mean, he will block some shots, but he's not a shot blocker at that level. He's not particularly mobile. But he's going to kick your ass as a scorer, and he's going to shoot the three. He's going to post up, as we were just talking about. He's got a mid-range game. He can pass as well as anybody in history at any position, basically. Right. So he's not in any particular model. So, and then there's probably, across the spectrum, so maybe Jokic is at one end of the spectrum as in terms of the scoring center. Rudy Gobert is way at the other end as the defense-only center. And then some guys in between on the spectrum, but it's interesting. Yeah, there is no one version of it. And actually, it's been fun to see Jokic win this way because I think the one question people around the league had over the last few years, Jokic becomes a perennial MVP or MVP candidate. He becomes an elite scorer. He becomes a triple-double machine. Okay, but in a league where the center has usually been your chief rim protector, can you build a defense that's sound enough to win a championship? I was asking this question. I was having this exact conversation with people as recently as February at the Sloan Conference, and I was saying it in regard to both Jokic and the Nuggets and Sabonis with the Kings, because Domantas Sabonis is now a primary center. He's not a power forward anymore. He's a full-time center, but he's not a rim protector. People have even referred to him as kind of like, whatever, baby Jokic, or poor man's Jokic, which is kind of insulting, but whatever. But another guy who can score and pass and can do a lot of things, but is not a defender. And if the center has traditionally been the anchor of your defense and your chief rim protector, and he can't do any of those things at a high level, can you build a good enough defense? Well, the Nuggets had a so-so defense during the regular season, but they were really good in the postseason, and especially in fourth quarters or at times that mattered most. And guess what? Yes.
Yeah.
You can win a championship.
We have the answer, yeah. And I think it speaks also to the idea that, schemes and team-oriented defense plays a bigger factor than we may have attributed to in the past, where we're always focused on individual defense. And I think just being able to be on that string, knowing when to rotate, when to cover for your man, that just means a lot. And even at the NBA level, it's going back to the fundamentals again, which is kind of one of the things that I keep thinking about when I watch the NBA now. Like I've watched since like the late 90s as well, and it's not the same game anymore. I mean, I went back a few weeks ago to watch the Game 6 of the the 98 finals, of course, because I'm a Jordan nut. And I was just kind of taken aback at not just the evolution of the three-point shot and how different it is there, but just the movement of it and the flexibility and how much people cut and move and recover and everything. And that leads me into this one about defense. Because when I speak to a lot of people, they say, oh, the defense in the 80s and 90s, oh, it was so much better. But it feels as though that back then you were defending from 20 feet and in, and now it's basically from 35 feet and in.
Yeah, people romanticizing the 90s is kind of a pet peeve of mine, or romanticizing the 80s for that matter. No one ever romanticizes 1970s NBA, so we at least do not have that burden to bear. The 70s were I think everybody kind of universally acknowledges kind of a wasteland for the NBA. Everybody glorifies the 60s, and then it's we'll just skip up to the Showtime versus the Celtics. Defense wasn't better back then. It was more physical. Flagrant fouls back then basically didn't exist. You could just beat the crap out of people. Does that make it better defense? I don't think so. I mean, scores are higher now because the pace is higher. Scores are higher now because the three-point shot is not just a thing, but it is a go-to weapon. It is a massive percentage of the overall game. Just because guys are shooting and making a lot of threes because they've gotten more skilled at it doesn't mean that the defense is by definition worse. That's ridiculous. It's just a math issue and a pace issue and a style of game issue. It's not about defense. It's harder to defend now because the court is so much wider, because you have at any given time 3, 4, and sometimes 5 guys stationed all out at the three-point arc. That wasn't the case in the 80s and 90s when we're glorifying the defense of that time. So you didn't have to guard as much ground.
Right.
You could just pack the paint and guard your man. Plus, you had illegal defense rules back then, so you weren't playing zone. There was just the entire style of game is different. It's not better or worse qualitatively, and it doesn't mean defense was better back then. By the way, it's kind of funny to look at it because pace has really increased in recent years, the last 10 years, and that has certainly increased scoring. But there are times in the past where pace was really high, before the 90s and the early 2000s dragged it way down. And if you look at some of those patches, go look up those old Lakers Celtics. Those finals weren't like hallmarks of defense. They're just running up and down the court. No one's really stopping anybody. Occasionally then somebody knocks somebody on their butt and we go, ooh, wow, how physical that was. It doesn't mean the defense was better. It just meant you were allowed to knock guys on their butt.
Howard, thank you so much for your time. My editor will kill me if I don't ask you this final question, though, since we're here in New York for the draft.
Sure.
Victor Wembanyama, I mean, one of the most hyped prospects of all times. I know you're not a draft guy, but even so, I mean, even you can't have missed that.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on him coming forward? What are your expectations?
I mean, it's funny the number of times in the last several years we've had to identify somebody as wow, I've never seen anybody who looks like that, plays like that. This guy is one of one. Because Kevin Durant was kind of one of one, and Giannis is one of one, and Luka, Jokic. We are in a time where, and this is a wonderful thing for the sport of basketball, it doesn't matter how short you are or how tall you are or where you're from on the planet. If you develop your skill set and you evolve a certain way in today's game where we have valued all of these abilities, all these skills, shooting, passing, ball handling, and we allow players to be, I don't want to say positionless, but positionally fluid, then you've opened up the door to Victor Wembanyama happening. Victor Wembanyama could not have happened 10 or 20 years ago.
Right.
Maybe. Look, like Kevin Garnett was the unicorn of his time.
Right.
We didn't recognize him as such then, and he was still kind of pigeonholed a little bit along the way. But Kevin Garnett was a transformative player. Dirk was a transformative player, of course. But Wembanyama is almost like the full evolution, right? The full realization of a time in basketball, and certainly in the NBA, where you can be 7'2", 7'3", wherever he's topped out at now. He might be 7'5" by the time the draft happens. And you can play every position on the court and do all the things he does. So, yeah, I'm not a draft expert by any means. I've seen enough of Victor Wembanyama film and some live games as well to see that this guy is special. He is absolutely in that category of transformative players, of evolutionary players. He has the chance to be an all-time great. So much else depends on that, right? So before we start making these proclamations of what he will be and what his career will be, there's all the other things, right? You have to stay healthy. And at his size, I think there's probably a reasonable concern of, well, will he hold up okay? You've got to keep working and improving your game, and you've got to be able to be adaptable and coachable, and you have to have a passion for the game. But he seems to check all those boxes, and that's why, again, he's this undisputed number one pick, and why the Spurs are so eager to finally be able to say it officially, because he checks all those boxes. And there are a lot of guys who have come into the league in my 26 years of covering this league who had all the requisite tools and the right body, the right skills, but maybe they didn't love the game, or maybe they didn't want to work hard enough at it, or maybe it was just bad luck. So you never know, and you can never assume too much. But if a guy has all of the above, all the skills and all the physical tools necessary, and they love the game and seem as passionate about it and as dedicated to it as Victor Wembanyama appears to be, and he seems like a great guy besides, and seems like he's got a great sense of humor, seems like a great people person, like you can't help but believe that the sky is the limit, and you can't help but root for him.
Howard, thank you very much for taking so much time out of your schedule. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.